All right. This is on? Yeah? It's working? All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the legibility of letters and words. But before I get started on that, I'm going to make a quick introduction into how we read. And this is very quick because it's a very detailed and complicated action in the brain. But basically, what we do is that when we see a word like the one, oh, I have this one. Does it work? How does it work? How does it work? And no, no, no. I want to point on the screen. I point. I do that. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay, so we look at the word down there, rows. So what happens when we see that? Two simultaneously actions take place. So one has to do with the feature detective. The brain goes in and look at the individual features of the letters, and then eventually decide, okay, so if we look at the letter O, we see, oh, there's some features there that seem like it's an O, so that means that it's not a C or an E or other similar letters. So while this goes on, there's another action which has to do with if you think of that you have a full library of all the words that you have read in your whole life. So you draw on that. So you see this word and then you say, oh, it looks kind of like nose or roll, but oh no, it must be rose because I have the information from the lower level. So we have these two levels that work at the same time, and they are equally important. So when we read, when we have this action going on, then also most of you probably know this, that when we read, we do not read like letter by letter, but we have these saccade moments on the line where we move forwards and fixate on certain places. But actually, what I did some. This slide is not correct because I made sort of even jumps there, but actually what happens is that they can be quite different. It depends on what you see in your peripheral view, and and that makes you decide where to land your eye next. So when we read, we have this center of vision. This is what we consciously understand, and this is if you read aloud, this is what you read. But while that is going on, the brain is already ahead of you and looking forward on the line to actually find out where the next fixation should happen. So we have these three basic reading components. So we have the library of words, and we have the individual letter and the features, and then we have this the peripheral view of reading. This is especially in running text. So, onto the letters. We know actually that, and this is quite an interesting study. What the researchers did was that they took a bunch of Arial letters, and then they blurred the letters in different places. And when participants they recognized the letter, they took all those letters and superimposed them on top of each other. And this is my illustration, but something similar to this happened. That you can actually see, and it makes good sense that if we take the top row there, CEO, that you got actually you need the counters of the C to see that it's a C. You need the crossbar of the E to see that is an E, and you need the side that is closed of the O to understand that is an O. So basically, to read letters, we need to see identify what makes one letter different from the other. So, what about legibility? Designers have often said that open counters, that's a good thing for legibility. And guess what? Science actually supports that. So that is, sometimes they actually go hand in hand. So in this study, researchers took a bunch of different typefaces and compared the individual letters so all the A's, all the C's, and so. And what they found was that on the green row, all those letters were more legible than the red row. And the same also with the C. You also see the thing with the open counters here. And the E. And the S. You also see serifs on the lower row here. So, if we go back to this, so here we see that the S, also that open counters appear to be a good thing in this study. This leads me to one of a study I did a while ago in collaboration with Kevin Larson. In that study, we looked at 3 different typefaces, but we designed in the different variations within these typefaces. Because the problem with studies like this is obviously that, for example, if you look at Rockwell, that it is in the red row there, maybe it doesn't have to. The reason it's placed there could be because of its heavier weight, or it could be because of the slab serifs, or whatever. You always have. So if when you compare different typefaces, you have so many different things that can influence the findings. So therefore, it's so much better that you actually that you use typefaces where you only have one thing that is different. Then you know exactly what it is that you're testing. So that we did in this study, but weirdly enough, actually I made a mistake when I designed these letters. For some reason, the spine of the S in the open S was more diagonal than it is in the other one where it's more round. And in this study, the open counter S actually ended up to be less legible than the closed counter S. So this indicates that the spine of the S actually in some cases can be more important than the open or closed counters. So round, nice counter spines of S. So this is an example from the same study also. 4 different letters E from within the same typeface. And here you can also see that you can do quite a lot of different things with the bowl of the E. As long as the counters are open, they are more legible than the closed one at the bottom. So this idea about open counters was also supported by a study carried out at Microsoft. Kevin Larson and Mathew Carter presented this a while ago at ATypI, some of you probably remember. What it is that when Mathew Carter designed the typeface Sitka for Microsoft, they carried out a number of investigations in the design process, looking at different variations of the letters. And what they did was that at a short exposure on screen, which is like really quickly and people have to identify what they see, they actually also confirmed the notion of open counters and decided on using something similar to the upper row. So back to the study I was talking about before, with the different variations of letters. We also looked at letter width. So in this case, the J. And here you see also in these 2 different typefaces, they have similar weight and structure. But in these 2 different typefaces, the letter J was more legible when it was wide than when it was narrow. And the same also go for the T. And the same also went for a lot of the other narrow letters. However, with the T here, you should be careful to not make it too wide. For what happened with this version of the T was that there was a lot of misreading for a C. So we know, the thing is that we have an idea about a letter. A letter T, we think of it as rather narrow. So if we make it too wide, it jumps into another category of letters, and then we misread it. So if wide letters benefit from being wider, then you could also say, okay, so let's like make the whole typeface wider, and then you adjust to that you have wider letters in the typeface, and it might be easier to read. But if you think back about to the point of the fixation in the middle of the text, the problem with wide letters is that you have fewer letters in the fixation, and also you have fewer letters in the peripheral view to orientate towards. And the same problem also with signage. In this case, they all have same point size, and obviously the lower row, the typeface looks much bigger, and it is because it's much wider. So if you scale it down because you have limited horizontal space on signs, then obviously what happens is that the wide letters, they have to have a much smaller point size, and then you lose the benefit of the wide letters. So yet another slide from the study of all the different typefaces. This with the M. Here you can see that a version with very narrow M, that is not a good idea, and that's probably because we have an idea about the M, that M is a wide letter, so then we think, oh, if it's narrow, what happens there? But what also happens here is that you see that a lot of the serif typefaces, in this case these two Gammon and Baskerville, they also ended up in a poor performance. So apparently serifs of M, they might maybe they actually melt together and they sort of dissolve the letter shape in that way. So that leads to a study of mine that I carried out in collaboration with Mary Dyson. What we did here was that we took one of my typefaces, that is a sans serif typeface, and then we added serifs. As I talked about before, it's quite important that you know that you only add one thing so you know exactly what you're testing. So we tested these two individual letters again, these different versions of these, or the sans serif and serif typefaces. And what happened was that, actually, kind of like the M before, the H showed that serif was not a good idea. Probably the same thing happened, that it melted together and looked a bit like a B. But something else that happened that I thought was quite interesting was that it appeared that on all these letters, serifs on the vertical extremes actually help legibility at the distance reading. So this is an example where serifs have a role to play actually. But as you see here, the I was not part of this. It was not a good idea to have serifs like that on the I. So we went back to look at the previous paper where we also looked at similar variations of the I. And in this case, we have 3 different versions. And here, the I with only a serif on the top performed better than the I without serifs and the I with serifs at both top and bottom. And over there, that was the study with all the serifs. So basically, what happened here was also like with some of the previous letters, that we have an understanding of the I as being a narrow letter. So if we make it too wide because we think that this is going to make it more visible, then people think it's something else. So for a legible I in isolation without a word around it, a serif on top and nothing on bottom, that is the most legible letter or version. Okay, so most often we see letters in combination in a word, so we have to make them work in a word as well. So if we stay with the topic of serifs, this study is quite interesting, because here they did what you have to do when looking at typeface legibility. The researchers here looked at different versions of Lucida, one with serifs and one without. And what they found here was at distance reading words in small point sizes, serifs actually perform poorer than sans serifs. So if you remember the previous study, where serifs were at distance, were more legible when the letters were in isolation, in this case, when in word, they actually worse. So serifs, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. So it would be interesting to check out. So why are these two studies different, and how can you what happens with serifs in words that is so bad? So if we go back to the Microsoft study, what they also did was that they looked at the letters individually, but they also looked at the letters in rows of 3 letters. And this, I think, is actually quite interesting. So in this case, it's the F. So if you understand the slide here, so we're looking at the F. So we look at the F in isolation here, and an empty circle means that there was no misreading for H or K, and a full circle means that there were a lot of misreadings. So alone, there was no misreading for those, but when there was a T afterwards, there was a lot of misreadings for K, and when there was an E afterwards, there was even more misreadings for K. So an F is not just an F, it depends on the situation or the surroundings. The same also for the L, that you see that there are misreadings for H and K, depending on the letters afterwards. And in this case, the I think this is quite interesting. There were no misreadings when it was placed within a word, but in isolations, there were the classical misreadings that we always think that A is misread for L or J. Yeah. So what happens here is that apparently it looks like the letters, they sort of melt together, and then they form this new shape that wasn't intentionally. So this leads to the next question. So what about spacing? So if we spread out the letters, then they wouldn't melt together in that way. And that issue is called crowding. So if you look at the top screen, I think that works the best. If you all look at the cross over there, and then try to identify the middle letter, it is much more difficult to identify the middle letter in this slide than in this slide. I go back. You see? I'm not sure the whole room can have the effect, but this is the effect of crowding. Crowding happens in the peripheral view, and it happens at distance also. What happens is that a letter within a word actually melts with the other letters. And this is special. This is obviously important in the peripheral view when you have running text. So this investigation looked at Times New Roman with eye movement, and what they found was that they looked at different factors that you can measure in eye movement, such as length of saccades, speed of reading, the time that you fixate, and so and number of regressions in the saccades. And what they found was that Times New Roman is quite closely spaced. So they found that slightly wider spacing than the default setting, that was actually the most legible for normal vision readers. But again, we have the same problem here. So if we say, okay, let's always space it quite widely, that is a problem when you think about the center of vision, that you lose letters in the center of vision and you lose letters in the peripheral view. However, interestingly, research shows that some dyslexic readers actually benefit from having wide letter spacing, and the same also go for some sorts of visual impairment. So this is a case where Microsoft, they released versions of the typefaces where they spaced it out for these groups of readers. So this study is a very recent study that I came across just a week ago. And this is an example that you see so many of when you work with these things, that you see researchers carrying out studies on typefaces without actually consulting type designer. And so these guys, they thought, oh, we can make this typeface. And they made the top one. And what they wanted to do, so the study is very interesting, and it's very valid in the way that it's structured and what they looked at. They thought that the idea was that to minimize crowding in the peripheral view, we know that large differentiations of the shapes actually minimize the crowding. So in that way, in this case, they were looking to help people that have loss of vision in the center of vision. So the idea was, so if we help the peripheral vision in typefaces, then it's going to be easier for them to read. So this typeface actually, but funnily enough, actually, they found with this typeface that it was in single letter and in words in the peripheral field of vision was actually more legible than Courier was. And you can say a lot of things. It would be nice if they had taken a more regular typeface like Times New Roman and compared to, and it would be nice if they had a designer to help them design the typeface. But overall, I think that it's quite interesting to, this shows that large differentiation in the peripheral view is quite a positive effect on reading. So does that mean that you should always have like very different letters? Should we mix up different typefaces and just go with that because that should be more legible? No, because research also shows that there's this idea of font regularity that actually plays a role, which is also sometimes called font tuning. And what happens here is that we have, when you see an E in a typeface, then you tune into that style of type. So you know what to expect when you see a C or when you see a T. So we are teaching our readers while they read what to expect in a typeface. So you can't just switch around like that. That doesn't really help reading. So overall, that means that this thing that type designers have done for years, that we reuse shapes and we rotate and we use elements from the letters and the new letter, that actually has a role, and it's important to keep doing that. So overall, for the most legible typeface, you should make large variations of the letters while you have great regularity. Thank you.